The holidays bring up at least a few opportunities to pull cookbooks off the shelves in order to find the perfect recipe for an occasion. These collections of cooking directions are often dog-eared and bulging from the newspaper and magazine clippings that act as addendums to the original text. Pencil marks cross out parts of recipes that don't work, as well as others, or offer substitutions based on what was in the pantry when the dish was last attempted. Cookbooks are already outstanding primary sources of their time periods, but can become even better, more individualized documents when analyzed complete with these alterations. And if anyone will wholeheartedly agree with the sentiment, it is Erin E. Moulton. Erin is a genealogist and researcher, as well as an author and presenter. She joined me earlier this fall to take a deeper look at the Out of Vermont Kitchens cookbook to see what it can tell us about the people and times that produced it. Welcome back to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source. I'm Eric Paul, and I'm joined today by a fellow primary source enthusiast. This is Erin Moulton, and she is, among other things, a librarian, a genealogist, a blogger, a researcher, an author. You've written both fiction and nonfiction, correct?
Correct.
Between the two, which is your favorite to write? And because I'm assuming, and I know that you use these kinds of your research techniques for both.
Yes.
Do you enjoy writing a good or fiction piece as a way to, get your...
It kind of has to balance itself out, right? I feel like I like to get absorbed in fiction and just go, and it's totally different experience, where the nonfiction I have to be very deliberate about and careful with. So I like it because I get a little bit of both worlds.
Right.
I don't have a favorite. It just depends on the day.
Yeah.
I have a favorite per day.
Now, I follow you on Instagram, and I love the kinds of things that you post because it reminds me so much of, particularly in grad school when I was, I loved research because, in undergrad, I took plenty of history classes, but they were all like the big lecture halls, and we didn't have a lot of actual digging to do most of the time. But in grad school, when you're in a seminar and you're with like 15 other people and that's it, and the professor gives you this great, like, it's like solving a puzzle.
Yeah.
Right. It's like you get like this task of, all right, here's the stuff that you need, and you get lost in the stacks.
Yeah.
But even better is when you can dig into the stuff that's really not like preserved, right? Like it's like just tucked away in the back of an antique store or something like that.
Exactly.
So we're going to be talking about one such thing. Today, the topic is the Out of the Vermont Kitchens cookbook, which was first published in 1939. And the copy that you brought up is from 1947. And you said this was the 15th or 17th printing of the book?
It's the 17th printing in 1947. And I'm sure it was printed beyond this one.
Yeah.
But it had quite a run.
That's amazing. In 8 years, they printed it 17 times.
Yeah.
What was it about this book that you said, this is what we should be talking about? What drew your attention to it?
Oh boy. Yeah. What drew my attention first? Okay. I'd say because I'm a native Vermonter, I liked the idea of kind of going back into a Vermont kitchen and seeing what they have.
Yeah.
And when I saw I do have an eBay problem. And so when I saw some pictures of it on eBay, I was like, oh, I want this. It looks special to me. And one of the unique pieces about it, besides, in a lot of community cookbooks, you'll see women's names along with a recipe.
Mm-hmm.
So church cookbooks, community cookbooks, sometimes they're made for charity. This one had the women's names, but it also uniquely has each recipe written in their own handwriting with a few doodles along the side. So that seems to elevate it for me to be a more of an experience of maybe getting like grandma's recipe box.
Right.
It feels
exactly.
personal. Mm-hmm. So the illustrations bring it up a notch. And then I made something, which also I'm happy to talk about, but I don't
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, so you that speaks to the endurance of these recipes. That did you have trouble filling the recipe with modern grocery stores, or was it actually super easy?
No. Well, there were a couple that I tried, and one of the first ones I tried was Nella Grimm Fox's maple cream. And it's interesting because the first thing that drew me was the bold handwriting. I mean, it was beautiful. It was like almost like you can't see that it's deep into the paper, but it had that kind of heavy handwriting.
Yeah.
And it was elegant. And I liked her name too. I was like, Nella Grimm Fox. This is so interesting. And I did not have success finding some things that she had. So her maple cream was essentially, because she said cut it into squares. So as I was reading it, I was thinking, okay, am I getting what this is? Can I make it? And it was basically caramels, maple caramels,
Oh,
right?
wow. Okay.
But she used maple sugar instead of syrup, which I don't often have maple sugar around. And she also used butternuts. And butternuts I have never had. So it said when I went online, I was thinking, okay, maybe I could replace butternuts. It said you could replace it with walnuts. So I made her recipe, and I switched out the maple syrup. And it worked great that first time I did it. And I never had it work that well again after. So I had to tweak it later on. But it's wonderful and sort of ethereal and just so mapley. If you don't like maple, you will hate it because it's very strong on the maple. But I now have tweaked the recipe enough that it is successful every time I do it. But I had to make because of it has to do with the fructose and the sucrose and how those can turn into crystallization too quickly if they're not tailored. So I have to put in like cream of tartar, and it comes together beautifully now. And the butternuts, funnily enough, when I was doing research on this person, I contacted the Rutland Public Library because there's a Nella Grimm Fox room there.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, so she was a pretty big figure then in the community.
Yes. So she was the daughter and also then the business owner of Grimm's maple syrup manufacturing. It was an evaporator manufacturer company. And her father had created this. He was originally from Germany, came over, they went to Vermont, and he made this kind of invention where he refined an evaporator and then he sold it. So she ran that business for a long time after he had passed away, and was very well off. And she bequeathed a huge amount of money to the Rutland Public Library. And so I called them and they said, funnily, they have butternuts all over Rutland, butternut trees everywhere, and they just plunk down onto the yard. So
isn't that wild?
I could do with that. No wonder it's in her recipe.
Right. Well, and that's so revealing. So just that alone, just the one recipe tells you endless amounts of information about the time period.
If you're willing to dig for it, yeah.
Right. But I mean, just on the surface, it's like, okay, so she could put this recipe, get butternuts, and one of the questions that I always ask with a primary source is what locations are associated with it. And you said there's record of this cookbook finding its way all the way to Japan and Hawaii.
Right.
And so it's like, in order for it to be more than just like a nice little gift, to be actually useful, the contents of the recipes need to be found at, local stores and, stuff like that. So it really does say a lot about what people had access to at different time periods. And was the book updated frequently with each printing? Did they add more stuff?
I'm not sure. I have looked at articles about the book. It doesn't say so within the book itself. And I've looked at articles about the book, and I didn't see anything about additional, recipes, but it very well could have them. I'm not sure because I haven't seen the earliest one, the 1939 version. Maybe it's a lot thinner. But yeah, this one also they had said showed up in editorial, like cooking journals and that sort of thing. So I think once it hit just the market, people would pick it up as a gift. It's a kind of a quaint New England gift, and then it gets passed around, and people start talking about it. Cooks start talking about it. Women who need to, housewives, they're trying to find unique recipes. They're talking about it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely went farther beyond many other community cookbooks I've seen.
Right.
I have a lot.
Well, so it's what I like about this, and I think that what it really is informative of is that, so the first printing and then the 17th are separated only by 8 years, but what a difference those 8 years make. So the first printing, 1939, the country, the United States, and Vermont is no exception to this, is, they don't realize at the time, but they're on the heading out of the Great Depression, but still the effects of the Depression are being felt. People are, had to adjust their lives or change their lives entirely because of it.
True.
And then 8 years later, in between that time, you have the Second World War and all the huge, massive, effects that has on the entire globe. And then the country by 1947, and again, Vermont's no exception to this, is a completely different place.
Right.
It's the land of plenty. There's, the economy is on a huge rebound. And so it's almost like I'm guessing, this is just kind of a little theory here, is that by the time, because the copy you have says wedding gift, right? 1947.
Right. Yep, exactly.
And, as we know there's lots of weddings going on after World War II. Yes. GIs returning home, or just people that, had wanted to be more financially stable, and the GI Bill allowed them to do that, or even if they had nothing to do with the war itself. It's a huge time for that. And so it's like, what a nice gift to give, what a nice gesture. This, like you said, this quaint, very classic New England. I think I was just talking to somebody, maybe even today, about there are major differences between Northern New England and Southern New England.
Okay, gotcha.
You know what I mean? And like, I think here in Northern New England, so, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, it's not like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, as far as, and I have family in those states, and, I have, but there's so much more bustling, and
that's true.
Whereas like in Vermont, you go east, like Burlington sneaks up on you, like you're driving through Vermont, and it's like woods, trails, skiing, and all of a sudden a pretty sizable town.
Right, exactly.
But like you go east of Burlington just a little ways, and you're already in the
you're in the rural area again. Yeah.
There's cabins, and it's in the Green Mountains and everything. So it's like I could see where this would have that appeal, almost exotic in some ways for people. In
some ways, yeah, sort of. And also you made me think, as we're traveling through those time periods, it's not an extravagant book. It doesn't have these incredibly complex recipes or anything. It just has like simple, good recipes that it seems like you would easily rely on. And I've made a couple of other ones, and I've been able to pull them together, and you don't usually have a ton of ingredients, but they're good ingredients, and they are, often locally sourced, like the maple syrup. How many maple syrup recipes do we have in here? Quite a few.
Right.
Because that's regional. Everybody has maple syrup in their house. My father-in-law will bring us these jars of maple syrup, but they're not maple syrup jars, because he works with the sugars, and the end of the season, it's the really dark stuff they can bring home, and it comes in an olive jar, or whatever jar they had lying around that was cleaned and sterilized, and they threw the rest in, and then it comes to my house, and it goes in my pantry, and I have a ton of it.
Yeah.
So, it's one of those things that Vermonters often will have, and people don't always in other regions at all. They're like, oh, maple syrup, like, why would I have that?
It's one of those things that when people visit Vermont, that's like what they buy.
That's true.
They need to get it. They love finding like those little roadside country stores or the general stores, and I'm assuming the 1940s were no exception to that either, where it was like, now is the time to go check it out and see what they have.
Right, exactly.
It's so, and cookbooks, you and I were going back and forth. It didn't take long to decide what we're going to do for our
Right.
topic, because I also find, a lot of great, because not only do cookbooks have and this one's unique in that it was handwritten, that's how they printed it, but plenty of cookbooks have the users, the owner of the cookbook will add their own adjustments.
That's right. Yeah.
And so did you feel brave enough to do that to your copy? Because you said you made some adjustments, but you didn't want to mess with it. It's almost like,
no, I have tabs in it, but not even sticky ones. Because I don't want to add an adhesive.
Yeah.
I always am careful, but yeah, I have just little bookmarks in it, and I don't write in. So if for the one that I amended for myself, I just printed out my own recipe of it instead of, but I do see little check marks in this one when I'm looking, not from the original pages, but maybe she was trying each recipe. So there's a little check mark in the corner of the recipes that she tried. And I didn't see any. I shouldn't maybe assume that it's a woman who it was gifted to, but I am going to, because I'm biased that way.
Right. Well, it's the time period. Yeah.
But I don't see any other handwritten notes. So she must have appreciated them. I do, and I should take this out. I do see a clipped popcorn treat article.
Huh.
It's a family and guests. So she clipped that from the newspaper for some popcorn balls, also with syrup. So whatever newspaper that came from. But other than that, there's not that many additions to this particular recipe book. And I do have some fully with their own recipes written in between.
Or other life events too. I mean, there's
True.
Because you kind of picture these in kitchens, especially in the first half of the 20th century, where the cookbook is almost like on an altar type thing, and they have it open, even if they've done the recipe a million times, they'd like to have that reference. And if a life event takes place, they'll jot it in there. And it's
right, exactly.
A yearbook of sorts, or something like, almost like a family Bible.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because it's like, that seems to be on a short list of books that people feel comfortable personalizing like that,
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because whenever it's also one of those things that people, genealogists, if we're talking about like research, you would not think to go look in the next thing I should put on my research list of places to go look is that community cookbook regional to that area. And yet you can find these gems in it, right? You can find little pieces of genealogy and family history in there as well as in genealogy, we always say family, associates, and neighbors. And a community cookbook shows that very well, right? Because if a particular community put it together, you have associates and neighbors all throughout that. So this one was by the Trinity Mission of Trinity Church, as well as the Women's Service League of St. Paul's Church. So it's got two different communities coming together, but within those women probably very likely knew each other and may have been neighbors. And that's so interesting to think of in this one little compilation. If you start thinking about it, that's very interesting.
I think I think more people should give genealogists like yourself a big thank you, because you bring people back to life in a much more real way than even Hollywood could try to do.
Right.
It's like you can see everything about the person through this kind of source. It's not just the excitement, it's the mundane. You can see it there every day. And so it's a really, on behalf of everyone, thank you for doing this work, because it makes it so much more, we feel that much more connected to it instead of being so distant by time. And
exactly. And I'm not like an amazing historian in any way. I'm a bad historian, I think. But what I think draws me to genealogy is that it's very much about an individual. It's almost like reading or writing a character-driven novel. You all of a sudden are seeing things more through one person's eyes, and there's more nuance. And that's what I like about it, because I can learn something about the time period, but I'm kind of traveling along with this person. Picking up the little pieces of where they left their records if I can. Sometimes you can't, but oftentimes you can.
Well, a community cookbook such as this is a really great place to leave one's mark.
Yes.
because each one of those recipes has a story behind it, like you were saying. And, I was telling before we recorded this that, my own household, I think the last experience I ever had with that kind of like recipe collection was when I was a kid. I remember our church in Newington, New Hampshire had a similar thing where they wanted from the congregation, everybody submit your best recipe. And I remember my mom, I think she submitted two. One was for this thing we called Popeye pie, which again is telling of the time period because, anything before the 1930s, if you called it Popeye pie, like what? Like eyeballs? No, it's because it has spinach in it, and it's a spinach quiche basically.
Ooh, okay.
And the other one that she oftentimes put in was those kinds of things was her banana fritters. And it's like she got some of those recipes everywhere from just like joy of cooking, but also others came from her mom,
right? Exactly.
And her mom may have gotten from somewhere else, and kind of passed down the line. And so by putting it into the cookbook, it's like broadcasting it to everybody else,
right?
So like it's like, here's my family tradition. Here's, Saturdays in the fall, Saturday morning breakfast for banana fritters. Like that was always a fantastic thing when we woke up and we smelled that cooking. Right?
That sounds amazing. Yeah.
And and then like other people might share it too. And then, combined with, and I know we made plenty of other people's food too out of that.
Exactly. Cookbook, and no one's going to send their worst recipe.
Right.
Right. This is what people are excited about. This is either a staple or one that was handed down or something they love, like you're saying.
Cheese and crackers.
It is. Yeah. It's something that is of value to a person. Usually their name is attached. And then you can just learn so much even from tasting it, which is what's so cool.
What's funny is that
you can experience it.
Right. And that same dynamics people try so hard to replicate it in the internet age.
Yeah.
But it ends up being frustrating as heck because you're trying to, you're using the magic of the internet to look up. What was it the other day? I wanted to make a warm potato salad because I didn't want to make it cool. So I typed in warm potato salad and like three things came up. And I thankfully found one that didn't have like paragraph upon paragraph of explanation to it.
Yes. Okay.
But so often if it's like potato and leek soup, my grandmother used to call us in from a cold winter day to, and like, and I know why they do it because the more you read, the more that you
is that
ads,
right? Okay.
And you spend more time on the website and all that. But it's so frustrating because it's like, even if some of these recipe books, these community recipe books did have, and some of them do have a little blurb of why it's a special recipe and when they, tend to make and stuff like that. It's limited, right? You're not
very limited.
And it seems it's not counterintuitive to in the case of the internet world. It's like, come on, I'm on the website because I want to get a quick recipe,
And I think it's gone like the opposite way, right? Because I just opened to a random page for cranberry frap, and I can read it if you don't mind me reading it, but it's so short. It just says boil 1 quart cranberries in pint of water 5 or 6 minutes. Strain through coarse cheesecloth, add juice of 2 lemons and 2.5 cups syrup made by boiling 1 pint sugar in 1 quart water 20 minutes. Freeze. And so then you do have to think really hard about the preparation in these, because I think one housewife handing it to another housewife is assuming, hey, you know how to cook this and this, so I'm going to give you the bare bones of it. But if you're not that skilled in the kitchen, like I am not really, but I do love making food. I can make some really decent meals. But sometimes I'm thinking, should I add this before that? Should I be careful about, do I need to churn it? Should I be picking up on something that I don't clearly see? I don't know. There's always little things I'm wondering if I'm missing in some of the very spare
wonder
moments.
If there's like something that if you were alive in the 30s or the 40s,
right,
you wouldn't even have to wonder, but time has kind of erased that, and and the ease of
or that happened to me with making a lemon meringue. It said make meringue, and I was like, okay.
That's a recipe unto itself.
I was just like, okay, I'll just I don't know how to do that. So I had to Google it, and
Yeah.
I'm breaking the egg whites, and it wasn't good. That one wasn't good.
That's too funny because that would require the modern person to have to find out, okay, so that's like 5 steps right there,
Right.
before I can even get into the next one.
And that one was amazing because it was very, you could barely read the recipe, and it was from like 1880 or 1890, and it was penciled in, just like we were talking about earlier, where it's penciled in on the side of the other recipes. And oh boy, I botched that one pretty badly. Make the crust, make the meringue, make the custard. Okay, this is so bad.
One of the fun things though about food, foodways and cooking and cookbooks throughout the ages is that for as many those kinds of trip ups you have, there's also a lot of connectivity. You can see either the evolution of food that we still enjoy, or people back then, 100 years ago, enjoyed some of the same things that we do now.
Right.
It's like, okay, so what has allowed for some of these recipes or these titles to endure so long? Was there anything like that in this book that you came across? You're like, oh yeah, that's everywhere. It's not.
Well, there were things that were that I would pick up on. So parfaits, and parfaits I had never heard of in this way. When I think of a parfait, I think of fruit and yogurt, and then fruit and yogurt, maybe a little granola on top. But in this, out of Vermont Kitchens, there were multiple parfaits, including a maple one. And all it was making an ice cream, but by hand, and you're whipping it in a double boiler, and then you freeze it. And I know I've seen recently like a no ice cream maker ice creams, and these beautiful, on Instagram, you see these beautiful photos of them scooping ice cream. And it's the same idea. Very simple. Don't need a lot of gadgets. I'm just sitting there over the double boiler, whipping the custard, and it came out beautifully. So I definitely have seen those. What did I make? I love sometimes even just cocktails. I was actually doing a little research the other day, and it was a woman who'd poisoned her lover with a highball whiskey. And I had, because I think he was going back to live, he had called it off. So they had a final tryst, and she had given him this whiskey drink, and it killed him. So
that's not in this cookbook, right?
It was a big case.
They didn't put that in the cookbook, right?
No, but it was in the newspaper, and I was thinking, I want to make this a cocktail. So I'm doing research on these old cocktails, and I was thinking highball was a glass, but there was actually a highball whiskey cocktail, which just whiskey and club soda. So okay. I thought that was interesting. I hold the poison for my own recipe, obviously.
Right. Yeah, you don't want to do that. Well, it's funny that you said my wife had a glass earlier today. She had milk in it, and she was like, I thought it was a candle holder, and she was like, no, I think it's called a highball.
Oh, interesting.
But it's funny because he said that, because I'm like, where did we get that out of? And it must have come from the cocktail itself, kind of like how all ice cream nowadays, anything that has like toppings on it, people call it a sundae.
Right.
And I'm like, no, an ice cream sundae is very specific. There's like it's 3 scoops of vanilla, hot fudge, whipped cream,
I remember the hot
nuts
fudge,
and a cherry. That's a sundae. I used to work in an ice cream place, and I would drive me nuts. And people like, I'll have a hot fudge sundae. I'm like, okay. And I start making, they're like, with marshmallows and Rocky Road ice cream, and I'm like, that's not a hot fudge sundae then. Like,
it's your own thing,
right? You just made up your own concoction. I just want to, kind of go from the why did they make it?
Oh yeah.
Why did they make this particular? I'm sure they're not the first group to ever come up with the idea of let's make a community cookbook, but it was a financial thing. You said originally it was to fund church projects.
Yeah. So they apparently had seen this kind of book from other states. I think they even referenced one in Connecticut. Oh, this was a really nice collection that a church community did, and so they put it together. But they did change things and made it very unique with their illustrations and the handwriting. And I think that helped, but it actually really helped fund both churches. So I know they added pews to one of them. They also did a kitchen and, whole new church kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
And there were other little projects that also happened because, women got together to write down recipes. So it came back to the church in nice, positive ways.
I suppose that reveals that, and that's probably why they keep doing it. That to me reveals a couple different things. Is one, we have this perception, I think, of when the first printing came out in 1939, of the Great Depression of, if you weren't homeless, you were an Okie traveling the country looking for work. And if you weren't doing that, then you were selling pencils and apples on Wall Street because you just lost everything. And that simply wasn't true. I mean, there's plenty of people, and particularly in places like Northern New England, where they always kind of lived a modest life to begin with. It wasn't, they lived off the land. They, like you said, maple syrup has been, maple products have been a staple of the economy in this part of the country for centuries. It's not a new thing. Mm-hmm. And so, the changes that came with the Depression, as far as, some people's lives changed dramatically.
Right.
But plenty of people, especially, people of the earth kind of folk, it wasn't a huge thing to overcome because they always just kind of lived off their own wits and, lived locally and did everything.
Right. And living locally, sometimes these towns, and even today still, are so little and they'll have a couple of institutions at the core. Mm-hmm. Right. And so the church might be it, or the Grange or whatever, or there might be the library. And those are those core meeting places. Right. So they all would rely on each other in those communities as well. And I often saw, whether you're church or not, sometimes it didn't matter. So there was one recipe book in dairy that I was looking at in the museum collection, and it was from the 1895 Women of the Dairy Depot, and it just said Women of the Dairy Depot. Mm-hmm. And so anybody could write a recipe for it, and it was for funding part of St. Luke's Methodist Church. And so it again was a fundraising project, but not all of the women were of the church. Mm-hmm. It was just happened to be something that the town was trying to help with. Right. And because it was a small community, everybody was in for it, and they helped.
I'm sure it had a lot to do with the layout of a lot of those towns. Mm-hmm. And sort of because much of Vermont was actually carved out on a map in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, mm-hmm. Back in the 1760s. Royal Governor Benning Wentworth, pretty much wanted to get his more or less monopoly over the trees, the forests of New England before New York got its hand on it. And as such, you end up with these very, similar sized towns. They are all, since they were all created in a time before motorized transport, they had to be, I think it's like 12 square miles, maybe even smaller than that.
Is that how they split it?
Something so that the idea was that you could make, if you lived in the further outer reaches, you could make it by foot to the center of town in about an hour.
I gotcha. Okay.
And, because it would be unfair to, conduct the business of the town, this kind of thing, actually.
Right.
If you were like the guy way over there, and left out. So they made it small. And that's why, as you go further west in the country, by the time you get to those 20th century states like Arizona,
yes,
they're massive, because by that point you had automobiles, you had trains, you had and so it's it seems like that, they're not incorporating tons of towns.
No, but they also split things up. So with dairy, it would migrate, right? So East area was the original. Now I'm talking about New Hampshire, but we're thinking about New England. So just as an example, East Dairy was a small original area where the settlers came in, and then it kind of moved because of the turnpike. So the dairy village cropped up, and then the depot came up a little farther. And so then the dairy depot, which was West Dairy, it became much bigger than the other parts of dairy because the train ran through.
Right.
So it would migrate.
Train depot, yeah.
Exactly. So, and then there was a need for another library because the people of the West Dairy, who are shoe factory workers, couldn't make it all the way to the high end of East Dairy to go to the library. So it would develop then along there. They'd add another library. It'd become kind of a different town center. And it kind of has a different feel, but it is still all the same town.
To use a food pun, this is my bread and butter. I love transportation, settlement history. I love it. This episode is being released on Thanksgiving Day here in the US, and if there's any holiday that puts the foodways of northern New England in the spotlight, it is this day of cooking and feasting and fellowship. You may be referring to a cookbook as you listen to this podcast, so I'll resist the urge to rattle off random measurements and ingredients. In the age before ready-made meals and takeout or delivery, every day of the year could demand the use of a cookbook. And so these books were on the same level as the family Bible or a personal journal to households. And for those of us, like Erin and I, who spend a good amount of time wishing to learn more about people of the past, cookbooks are an indispensable primary source. Cookbooks in general are just such a great clue into so many elements of everyday life, like we were saying before, and also the role of, in this case, women in society. We see both world wars as elevations of women in society, but then after each one, there seems to be kind of another, not total step backwards, but a little bit of a receding of women's roles. And I was doing a little bit of research before we got on about the Burlington, Vermont area and just Vermont in general during World War II. And it seems like the communities pulled together just the same way the rest of the country did, where they contributed men. It also said plenty of women went overseas as well, in different roles and capacities. And everybody, just like the rest of the country, it was an all hands on deck effort. Everybody was pitching in, doing what they could. And it really is like the last time you see that kind of thing in U.S. history anyway, of people making handmade gifts to send to troops overseas, or collecting their excess fat from their recipes and to be transported off.
For sure.
It's such a different time period, and that's what I was saying at the beginning of this particular publication. The covers, as far as I've seen, look pretty much the same. 1939 to 1947, it's the same artwork, but so much has changed, in that time from before the war, during the war, to after the war, that it's actually pretty remarkable that they maintained that appearance still by the end.
But I think the leaning into quaint New England maybe helps, right? It's almost like it just helps as a selling point, possibly, because people like the idea of, they romanticize quaint New England, right? So I think that's there. But actually made me think of something as you were saying that, I was thinking about, I always look for context around the people when I'm researching. And I think that's really important to kind of key into the timeline, like you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah.
I didn't think as much of big events when I was researching Nella Grimm Fox, who was our one from Rutland in here, who did the maple creams. But I did look around, her life, both family-wise and also in terms of expectation, typically, of women during that time. And she really bucked the norm. So she didn't get married until later in life. She was maybe 49. I can't remember the exact age, but it was because she was running her father's business.
I was going to say that must have been in itself out of the ordinary too.
It was, yes. So then it kind of was noted in the newspapers, but it who looks after the business now is Mrs. Nelligrim Fox. And then later on, it reflected on her as a shrewd businesswoman who knew how to talk at the same level about politics at the same level of a man. She was groomed from a young age for business and doted upon by her father, who brought her to New York for piano lessons. And then when he passed away, she took over the business and ran it for decades. And then she put off marrying her childhood sweetheart, John Fox, until late in life. And they got married. They never had children, which was also Buckingham.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
So you said that her father he immigrated from Germany, not her, yes. Right? So she was born in the United States.
She was born in Ohio. And then they came to Rutland early. She was young when they got to Rutland. Okay. Yeah. And she had a sister and maybe a brother, I can't remember, but it was really sad. Her sister committed, she had like a lot of deaths in her family in a short period of time. So prior to her father passing away, her sister committed suicide because of scandalous talk that had started about her around town. So there's another expectation. Yeah. Maybe she was bucking a norm in a different way. I don't know.
It's so amazing because you would like just her recipe about maple cream. You would never know this about this person. No. I mean, why would you? Why would like, you? Yeah. To most, and if this, with the number of books that this sold and distributed as wide as it was, how many people made that recipe having no idea at all of what a unique individual she was and how so much of her life was different. And I guess you could extend that by saying, well, the odds are at least another 5 to 6 people in this group. I mean, everybody's life is important and individual. But like, how many of them? It reminds me of when I was in grad school. I did some research. I had a project. We chose to do either a thesis or a project, which I lived. So my apartment was right across the street from a building. It was still in operation at the time. I think it still is. It was called it was a rest home for women in particular. It's just called the Ladies' Home of Oswego, and but it had opened up in the 1870s as the home for the homeless. That's how it was a community chest. Basically, people every year there was newspaper ads saying we need everything really. If you have excess food, if you have firewood, any, just please bring it. Money, of course, to buy all these things. And my job, the project was to go through their papers, go through all of their stuff in the attic. Literally, I felt like it was in the Never-Ending Story. So I lived right across the street, so it was great. Like a Saturday, Sunday morning, I would go over there. I'd say hi to the residents, get some coffee, go up to they gave me a little room that was being unused, and I would just bring the boxes down. And did I get lost or what on purpose? Like there was this one book in there. It was incredible. It had biographies of each of the residents as they came into the building, starting with the first group.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And it was like one of the women, she was, she and her husband had immigrated to the country before the Civil War, I think from the Netherlands or Germany. And not long after they got there, her husband went into the army in a local regiment. And he was mortally wounded at Gettysburg. And it was so recent that they actually had misspelled Gettysburg. And they just referred to it in the last war. They just said, he was killed. And so that led me to this huge, I went on this huge tangent where I started researching the 147th New York Infantry, like crazy. And it was also brilliant because right down the street, on the same exact street they lived on, was the Historical Society. And they had they had so much stuff there, including the Congressional Medal of Honor that was given posthumously. Actually re-given is the only woman who's ever received it, a woman named Mary Walker, who is from that town and also she bucked the system.
I know who you're talking about. I think.
So she was a surgeon in the Civil War.
Yes, I know who you're talking about. Yeah,
was like captured and as a spy and was traded and
but she got the Medal of Honor, right?
She did, and then they took it away from her while she was still alive. She went on to become a major women's fashion reformer.
That's right. She wore the pants
as a man.
Yes,
and then she after she died, I think it was Jimmy Carter's, over 100 years later, that he gave her back, and they had it there. It was so cool.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's just one example of how, and Mary Walker has nothing to do with the ladies' home, but it was just like these cookbooks,
right?
All it takes is just like that
curiosity
little ember, right? It just starts burning you. And then you're like, next thing you know, you find out these people have fantastic lives,
right? That
are, you could write a Hollywood script about
easily
Nella Grimm Fox,
Yes. Yes. And I think that's so fascinating. Well, one of the things when I'm teaching a genealogy session, one of the main things I find myself repeating is look close, then look closer, because you're always going to miss something, but also it takes a minute to pay attention and dissect what you're looking at. If you're looking at the whole thing and then trying to understand its context, and that's for me what usually sends me off on a little research adventure. So you're looking at the name, you're looking at the time, you're looking at the place, and then you can go based on those things if you know where to look.
Yeah.
But that's part of the fun of it, is learning how to go and look and find out what you're looking for.
Would you say that the internet helps a genealogist and a researcher, or can it sometimes lead to kind of like false starts? Like you think you're onto something and then you just hit a dead end. You're like, there's no way I can go further because I'm not physically at the collection that I'm meant to be.
I think it's amazing and also a problem sometimes. So also with the algorithm, I love Ancestry so much. I'm so delighted by it. But I do, when I talk to people who are like, I can't find out anymore, sometimes they're hitting the tree hints, and that means that when you're doing that, even though it's amazing and it's a rush and you're going through your family tree, you're not in control of your research. Your research is being pitched to you, and sometimes it's not accurate. Right. So if you're going to be in the driver's seat, you have to make more of a game plan. Right. And then I think if you make the game plan and you know the different areas you can look and you know what you're looking for, that's when you start to have that edge where the internet's like super amazing for you.
And using the right databases and the right sites.
Otherwise, you're kind of you're in a rabbit hole, and you might be, there's another shiny thing, and then you're gone.
And then you end up right back where you started too. Right. I've had that happen before too.
Exactly. And did I do that? I don't remember.
Right. I remember going to local libraries because they had the library edition of Ancestry, which is you can get to most of the stuff there, and it was just a great way to pass the time. If not, I didn't really have a plan, but I ended up finding a bunch of relatives of mine, and learning more about the family that I would never have known just from family stories and stuff. And it was so remarkable having kind of that almost like a third person perspective on it, and not having where I could like remove myself from the family but still see my family name. It was kind of weird in print like that. Going back to the cookbook, one of the things that I like about this compared to some of the other things that I cover in this podcast is that it, as a cookbook, was intended to be a secondary source. It's about cooking and recipes. It wasn't really meant to be a primary source, but that's what makes it that much stronger for the researcher to be able to say, this tells me everything that I need to know about this particular community.
Exactly. Yes.
And even where would, did you have any evidence of where it was sold? Like, did you have to order specifically from?
I saw an article, where was it, that said, Mrs. So-and-so is now the new distributor for the Out of Vermont Kitchens book. So I'm sure it went into little shops, but I think someone would bring it around in their, this was later, I think in their car, and either sell it to shops or by hand. But I think they just found retailers for it, small shop probably even country stores.
Like outside of Vermont, though? I mean, did they like? Could you get it at a store in California, or
I
would it have
think
to be
New
sent
England, I
from?
think it did go to different New England shops, as far as
Okay,
I understood.
and
But
then they would send it off to their.
exactly. I think when they were saying it went to Hawaii and Japan, I think that was referencing maybe it was given as gifts
Right.
or to send to soldiers.
And probably GIs, yeah, they brought a lot along with them, because
Yeah.
it makes perfect sense because by 1947, this is Japan was occupied,
Right.
and so it's perfectly reasonable that that was something that maybe a soldier from Vermont, really wanted to have something of his own, or maybe
Right.
hand off to somebody that I like what you were mentioning before about the quaintness that Vermont and the other New England states represent to
Right.
people in that time period. And it's such an important thing because, the West had really come into its own by the early 20th century there's a historian by the name of Richard White who poses his thesis is that what we know as the West, pretty much everything west of the Missouri all the way out to California is the product of the Civil War and World War II.
Right.
That especially all the federal lands that were developed after the Civil War, between the two wars, and then with all of the high tech industries that developed after World War II. Of course, something that has pictures of maple trees and has all these cute little and it's like even some of the more prominent Americans of that time period were from originally New England,
because it's the old part, right?
It's right. Like, it's the old, it's the part that's been around forever, and it's, even though it has the word new in it, New England, it's not new anymore. It's always funny, like when I travel outside of, the country by a far distance, how almost like, mythological New England is to some people.
It's so interesting. Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, the trees change, brilliant colors. I'm like, yep, they do, and see all the big coach buses of people from the South, and from the Southwest coming up and checking out the things. And then likewise I could imagine another reason why some of these, besides GIs, is that after World War II, you have a generation of snowbirds, people who are, either not retired yet, but like spending more time because a lot of times military service gave them exposure to other parts of the country that they would not have otherwise had a reason to go to. They're like, oh, it's really nice not being, negative 30 degrees in January. Let's go check that other place too. But I still want that taste of home. I really want.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think the comfort of maybe it feels like, mom, or because all those handwritten recipes and delightful, delicious sounding foods.
Yeah.
Who doesn't want cream puffs and chocolate dessert and special puddings? There's just so many wonderful ideas in there, and you can kind of experience it even if you're just reading it, if you have a good imagination.
Yeah. Well, I liked what you said about the frap as well.
Yeah.
And how you could freeze it. And doesn't that say something about access to technology in that era too? And it's kind of a transitional age where some people still had the ice boxes, traditional, in fact, the house I'm in right now, here in Moulton, New Hampshire, I'll hesitate giving my address out, but it was built actually coincidentally in 1939 to be kind of like a flop house for the ice harvesters.
Okay, sure.
And so, it was changed around a little bit over the years to actually include rooms, but what I understand is it was just like a couple floors, and that was like just 4 walls for guys to, sleep on cots, and probably was built by one of the ice companies just as a way to give their labor, a place to stay.
Right.
And the fact that existed and they built it obviously they weren't like, yeah, this electric refrigerator thing's gonna catch on. There's still must
Right,
have plenty
exactly.
of people that their
Especially
definition of
in
freezing.
rural, right? Rural
Right.
New England.
Yeah.
So they would have been doing it a different way. And then my grandma had, when we did an oral history project, she was talking about, she remembered the ice house when she was little. And then later on, they had to feed the meter for the fridge.
Oh,
For,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, to make it run. Or something like that. I thought that was interesting. You could choose when it was on. I don't know.
It must have
how
been
much power it was.
and even as 1939, electricity, and especially rural, was still kind of a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
Of being able to manage it. People were worried sometimes that if they didn't have the plug in the wall, the electricity would run on the floor.
Right.
Like, oh, the electricity is all over the place again, shockingly. And so I mean, that was like, people are still getting used to modernity. They weren't quite there. So it's just funny to me that you said that has its instructions just simply put freeze. Like,
yeah, it just says freeze somewhere.
Does that mean that you can only make this in February when you can just chuck it outside and it'll freeze instantly? Or is it something else? And for listeners at home, one of my dogs is, I don't know what her deal is. I think she has something that she's trying to cough up for a while. So it's picking up
She's
on
come for help.
Yeah. That might be my cue to start wrapping things up a little bit so I can see what's going on with her.
All righty.
So the last question, we talked about, and as it always happens on this podcast, we have the list of questions, and your answers are fantastic. But we are always answering things kind of out of order just because it's conversation.
For sure.
So when it comes to prescriptive versus descriptive, it has to be prescriptive because it's a recipe book. It's not like there's going to be a lot of people just kind of winging it and being
exactly.
like
it's trying to tell them the order and how to do it.
Like, if you don't do that, but it's like there is some description involved because, like you said, the location that's coming from, they could only work with what they had on hand. So they
when we look at it as a source, it's a time capsule of the time period and the place, right? So it feels descriptive in that way, where we're easily able to learn something about that time and place if we're being analytical,
right?
But it definitely their intention, I think, was to be prescriptive,
right?
For sure, yeah.
Well, I think it's like the actual, and just like any other recipe, the amounts that you use of different products, that's very descriptive.
True.
It's not, it's once you start adding in things like verbs and adjectives, that's when it starts to get prescriptive. It's like, so I have 3 eggs. I don't know what recipes, I'm just making it up. 3 eggs, cinnamon, and 2 cups of cinnamon. That sounds disgusting, actually, but yeah. Please don't follow this recipe. I'm making it up as I go. Like half of a python, and put that together. And so that's descriptive. But then, but again, that's very revealing of their world. Like they are putting together their tried and true recipes that they've always had access to this stuff. They're not like, because I think we've all been there where we really want to make something and we open it up and it's like, get this spice or, and I'm like, where am I going to find that? Like, they don't have it at Market Basket.
Especially in rural New England. You're
right.
Like, I don't know where to get that. It sounds delicious, but I have to order it online.
And then it's like $12.50 for a little jar of whatever it is.
I know. I love that on Bon Appetit. It'll be like, just go to your local butcher and have them give you this particular cut. And I'm like, sometimes you don't have that option, although obviously where you're living you do. Right.
Well, it says a lot about geography as well as like how well we know each other. So it seems like in this cookbook that you have, nothing comes across as pretentious, right? It seems all very
really, no.
Like folksy and like most people, if anything, people would have an abundance of some of the things that in Vermont they don't.
Exactly.
wherever they might be. So if somebody's, putting this stuff together just, a little bit
On the
further south
fly.
in New York, they would probably be able to do that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But all of these, both time periods is like predates the supermarket by a couple of years.
True.
People
True.
hadn't quite gotten to that point where, they have these giant buildings just full
of food
and refrigeration and stuff. But this has been fantastic. I love talking about this stuff, and I really hope this isn't the last time that you appear on this podcast.
I hope not.
I credit my wife with saying, I think she messaged you at one point saying, I think you'd be perfect for the EPS podcast. And I couldn't agree more. So I've had
family magic. I do enjoy Instagram. It's just
I use it more than any of the other
I can't go on the
outlets.
others so much. It just stresses me out. But Instagram doesn't stress me out.
Yeah, it's nice and simple, and it's still pretty, you can do a lot with it still.
Right.
Despite it, just being mainly photographs and stuff.
Exactly.
So where can people find you besides Instagram? Where can they find you online?
Online, I'm at erinemoulton.com. So that's easy to find me there. And I also do a lot of different events for libraries, and you're always welcome. Public libraries are great about just allowing people to attend their programs. You don't usually need to be a member of that library. And so if you're interested in any particular program or research, they're usually research related. So I like to talk about, I'm more of a researcher than I am an expert. I'm sure that's been gathered at this point. I'm an expert on research. So I talk a lot about how to research and different record sets and different avenues for genealogy research. And that's under the events tab. So that's always a good place to find me just talking.
And it's a really good thing to be an expert in, honestly, is because it's a dying art. It's not something that comes easily in the Google age of just being able to get quick answers of
right.
And that's why I can't ask for a better guest for the EPS podcast, where everything.
Thank you.
So thank you again for joining the EPS podcast, where everything, including the Out of Vermont Kitchens cookbook from both 1939 all the way through 1947 and beyond, is a primary source. And we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Just about halfway through Season 2 of the EPS podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to what you've heard so far. Full-length episodes like this one are being delivered on Thursdays, while shorter episodes, the products of my EPS podcast live exhibits, come out on Tuesdays. If you like what you hear, consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/EPS podcast. Follow the show on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. I look forward to you tuning in again to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.